She paid $9 for 64 goats, and the man who sold them to her said, with genuine concern in his voice, that he hoped she knew what she was getting into. She said she did. She loaded the goats herself, which took most of an afternoon because 64 goats in the condition these 64 goats were in do not load quickly, and she drove them 12 miles north to the parcel she had leased on Hector Creek, and she put them in the south pasture, and she stood at the fence and watched them for a long time. The goats were thin. That was the most accurate description, and also the most charitable. Their ribs were visible. Their hip bones stood up under their coats like fence posts under canvas. They had the slow, careful movement of animals that have been rationing their own energy for so long that conservation has become habit. And they moved across the south pasture that first evening with the tentative attention of creatures that have learned not to trust that any new pasture will be better than the last. Agnes Crane was 47 years old. She had been a widow for 3 years. She had $12 left after the 9, which meant the goats had taken 3/4 of what she had, and the lease on the Hector Creek parcel ran for another 8 months. And what she did with those 8 months was everything. She knew this. She had known it before she loaded the goats. She had known it before she drove to the sale yard. She had known it when she woke up that morning and put her boots on and looked at the $12 in the coffee tin on the shelf and made the calculation that most people in her position would not have made, which was that 9 of the $12 was not too much to spend on 64 animals that everyone else at the sale yard had looked at and looked away from. Because Agnes Crane had been looking at goats for 22 years, and she knew the difference between an animal that was past help and an animal that needed help, and what she saw in the south pen at the sale yard that morning was 64 animals that needed help. Not one of them was past it. If this story finds you somewhere you didn't expect it to, leave your city below. I want to know how far a thing travels when it starts with $9 and 64 animals that everyone else walked past. The Hector Creek parcel had been leased to 3 different operators in the previous 5 years, and all 3 had struggled with the same problem, which was the south pasture's poor grass and the north pasture's rocky ground, and the creek that ran low by August, and left both pastures short on water through the dry months. The previous lessees had run cattle and found the carrying capacity inadequate. Agnes was not running cattle. She was running goats, and goats on rough ground with browse available are a different calculation entirely from cattle on the same ground, and the Hector Creek parcel had browse, because the 3 years of failed cattle operations had left the brush unchecked, and the brush had grown up along the creek bank and across the north slope in the specific thick, varied way that brush grows when nothing has been eating it, which was exactly what 64 goats needed, and exactly what Agnes had seen in the lease listing when she read it, and everyone else read inadequate water and walked on. She brought a bucket of water to the weakest animals that first evening, the 6 or 7 that had not made it to the creek on their own, and she sat in the south pasture with them while they drank, and she noted which animals were the most depleted and which were already showing the first tentative signs of something she had been looking for since the moment she saw them in the sale yard, which was appetite. Not hunger, appetite. There is a difference. Hunger is what an animal shows when it has given up expecting anything good. Appetite is what it shows when it has decided the situation might be worth engaging with. 6 of the 64 were showing appetite by the time the evening light went off the south pasture. She wrote their ear tag numbers in her notebook and went to make supper. The recovery took 6 weeks. This was faster than she had projected, which she attributed to 2 things: the quality of the browse on the creek bank, which was better than she had estimated from the lease listing, and the specific characteristic of the breed she had bought, which was a Spanish cross that had the reputation of being the hardest working browser in the territory and that earned that reputation on the Hector Creek North Slope in the first month by working through brush that she would have expected to take twice as long. By the 5th week, 40 of the 64 were visibly healthy. By the 6th week, all but 2 were moving through the pasture with the easy, purposeful manner of animals that have made a decision about a place, which is the manner of animals that have decided to stay. She lost the 2. She wrote their numbers in the notebook and the date and moved on, because moving on was the only direction the work offered, and she had been moving on for 3 years, and she knew how to do it. What happened in the 7th week was the thing nobody had planned for, which in Agnes Crane's experience was where most of the important things happened. The goats went north. They had been working the south pasture and the creek bank and the lower north slope, which was the territory she had expected them to work, and on a Tuesday morning in October, she came out for the dawn count and found 43 animals missing, not wandered, gone. She found the gap in the north fence, and she followed the tracks up the north slope and over the ridge and down the other side, which was not Hector Creek parcel land, it was the Aldous land, unfenced and unmaintained. And she was about to turn the animals back when she noticed what they were doing. They had gathered at the base of a rock formation about 200 yards north of her fence line, all 43 of them, standing in the particular concentrated, purposeful way of goats that have found something they want and are engaged with finding it. She walked to them, she pushed through the group to the rock face, and she looked at what they were looking at, which was a section of rock at the base of the formation where the ground was wet. Not recently wet from rain. The last rain had been 11 days ago. Wet in the way that ground is wet when something below it is moving upward, seeping through the rock and into the surface soil, in the slow, persistent way of water that has been doing this for a long time. She crouched and put her fingers in the wet soil. She pressed down. Water came up around her fingers within 3 seconds. She sat back on her heels and looked at the formation above her, and at the 43 goats working the wet ground around her, and at the ridge behind her, and the Hector Creek parcel beyond it. And she thought about the creek that ran low by August, and the 3 failed cattle operations, and the lease listings that said inadequate water, and she thought about what was coming up through her fingers right now, which was water that had nothing inadequate about it. She went to find the owner of the Aldous land that afternoon. His name was Birch, and he was in his 70s, and he received her at his door with the mild wariness of a man who has owned land a long time and has learned to be careful about people who arrive unannounced to discuss it. She told him what she had found. He listened. He said, "There's no spring on that land. I've owned it 30 years. She said, "There is now. Or there always was, and your cattle never found it, because they stayed on the flat." He said, "My cattle grazed that slope." She said, "Cattle graze. They don't work the rock base." He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "Goats browse. They go to the base of formations. They can smell the mineral in the water." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Show me." She showed him the next morning. He crouched where she had crouched and pressed his fingers into the wet ground and felt the water come up and stayed in that position for a long time without saying anything. When he stood up, he looked at the formation and at the goats, who had come back through the fence gap overnight and were working the base again with the absorbed, proprietary attention of animals that have decided something belongs to them. He said, "How much water?" She said, "I don't know yet. I'd need someone who knows springs to assess it." He said, "I know someone who knows springs." She said, "Then we should both talk to him." The man who knew springs was a retired surveyor named Cole who had been assessing water in the territory for 40 years and who came to the formation on a Thursday with his equipment and spent 4 hours at the site before he came back to where Agnes and Birch were waiting and said, without any particular ceremony, "That's a significant spring. The pressure suggests a substantial underground system. This isn't a seep. This is a source." He looked at them. He said, "This is one of the better water finds I've seen in this county in 20 years. Agnes did not allow herself any visible reaction. She wrote, "Cole, spring confirmed. Significant. Underground system. One of the better finds in 20 years. She wrote it and closed the notebook and looked at Birch. He was looking at the formation. He said, "My land." She said, "Your spring." He said, "You found it." She said, "My goats found it." He looked at the goats. He said, 64 skinny animals. She said, 62 now. He said, "What were you thinking when you bought them?" She thought about the coffee tin, and the $12, and the 9, and the calculation she had made that morning that most people would not have made. She said, "I was thinking they needed help, and I could help them, and that the Hector Creek parcel needed the right animals, and these were the right animals." He said, "You weren't thinking about a spring." She said, "I didn't know there was a spring." He said, "But you put the right animals on the land." She said, "I put the animals the land required." He was quiet again. Then he said, "What do you want?" It was the honest question, and she had been thinking about the honest answer since Thursday morning when she came out for the dawn count and found 43 animals missing. She said, "A partnership. The spring is on your land, and the lease on the Hector Creek parcel is mine for 8 more months. The water from the spring is what makes the Hector Creek parcel into something different from what it's been for the last 5 years." He said, "Different how?" She said, "The 3 operators before me all left because of the water. A reliable water source changes what the land can carry and what it can produce." He said, "You'd want access." She said, "I'd want a long-term access agreement and a share in whatever the spring produces commercially." He said, "Commercially." She said, Cole said, "Significant. Significant springs in this county have been developed for municipal supply and for stock water operations across multiple properties. I don't know which direction this one goes. That's a question for someone who knows the market." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "You have $9 left." She said, "3." He said, $3. She said, "I bought supplies." He said, "And you're talking to me about a commercial water operation." She said, "I'm talking to you about what the spring is worth. What we do with that is a separate conversation." He said, "All right." They had the separate conversation 2 days later at his kitchen table, which was where the separate conversations always happened in Agnes's experience. And what emerged from it was not a commercial water operation, not yet, but a letter of intent that Birch's lawyer drew up and that gave Agnes the right of first negotiation on any commercial development of the spring in exchange for the discovery, and a long-term water access agreement for the Hector Creek parcel that removed the inadequate water problem from the lease listing permanently. She signed it on a Wednesday. She drove home on the Hector Creek Road with the signed copy in her coat and the $3 still in the coffee tin and 62 goats in the south pasture that had cost $9 6 weeks ago and had found, in the 7th week, the thing that changed the calculation of everything. Still witty. The county heard about it before the month was out. Word traveled in the way that word travels in ranch country, which is faster than the road and less accurately than the facts. And what arrived in the county's conversation was a version of the story that Agnes found partly accurate and partly not, but which contained the essential truth, which was that a woman had bought 64 sick goats at a sale yard for $9, and the goats had led her to the richest spring in the county. The man at the sale yard, who had expressed concern about her knowing what she was getting into, came to find her in November. He stood at the Hector Creek fence and looked at the 62 animals in the south pasture, which were by November the animals he should have recognized from the sale yard, but which were so different in their condition and their bearing that he had to look twice. He said, "Those are the animals from September." She said, "Most of them." He said, "They look like different animals." She said, "They're the same animals. They just have what they needed." He looked at the north slope. He said, "The spring is up there." She said, "Other side of the ridge." He said, "I've been to sales in this county for 30 years. She said, "I know." He said, "I never thought about what goats do different from cattle." She said, "Most people don't." He said, "You did." She said, "I needed animals that would work the land the way the land needed to be worked. The breed made the rest possible." He looked at the goats again. He said, $9. She said, $9. He said, "I sold them to you for $9. She said, "You sold them to me because nobody else was buying." He looked at her. He said, "That's not an accusation," she said. "I know. It's just what happened." He put his hat back on. He drove away. She stood at the fence for a while longer and looked at the south pasture and the creek bank and the north slope above, and she thought about the morning in October when she came out for the dawn count and found 43 animals missing, and followed the tracks over the ridge and found them at the base of the formation with their heads down and their purpose clear and their noses doing what their noses had been built to do, which was find what was in the ground that the ground was not showing from the surface. She had bought them because they needed help, and she could help them. She had put them on the Hector Creek parcel because the parcel needed the right animals, and these were the right animals. She had followed them when they went north because she had learned in 22 years of working with goats that when they go somewhere with that kind of purpose, the correct response is to follow and find out why. The spring was still running on the other side of the ridge. Cole had said it would run regardless of the season, which was the characteristic of an underground system under sufficient pressure, and which meant the Hector Creek parcel's 8 remaining months of lease would be spent building towards something that the previous 5 years of failed operations had never been in a position to build toward, which was a working relationship with the land based on what the land actually had, rather than what the people who leased it before had needed it to have. She went inside. She put the coffee tin back on the shelf, $3 in it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the notebook to a new page and wrote the date and started on the plan for the spring, which was where everything had arrived and from which everything that came next would begin. The plan took 3 evenings to complete. Not because it was complicated, but because she wrote it the way she wrote everything that mattered, which was carefully and with the full understanding that what she wrote now was what she would act on later, and acting on something written carelessly was how people ended up with outcomes they hadn't intended. The plan had 2 parts. The first part was the Hector Creek lease and how to use the remaining 8 months with the water access agreement in place, which changed the carrying capacity of the parcel enough to make it worth renewing when the lease came up, which she had not been planning to do before the spring. The second part was the spring itself, and what Cole's assessment meant, and who else needed to know about it, and in what order. She wrote both parts, and looked at them, and then she closed the notebook and left it on the table and went to bed, because the plan was the plan, and sleep was what the morning required. What the morning required was the goats. They always required the morning first.